Okay, good morning everybody. Let's get started with this. Okay, let's get started. As you might have noticed, I hadn't put the lecture videos for the last week online. To be honest, I'm experimenting with this. I'm seeing how this works. I think, as I said at the beginning of the course, showing up pays. This is a course you do need to learn. Actually, you do need to learn a lot if you want to get a good grade. This is going to be not an easy course. This is not going to be an easy exam. So I highly recommend you to factor that in, right? So there are clear studies. It's not just me making this up. There are clear studies. People. There's a correlation between showing up, between doing the readings and studying for this course and the grade at the end of the day, right? So to have that at the beginning. Okay, let's get started. I know you guys are here, so here we are. And today I want to get started on social network analysis. And I want to give you an introduction into social network analysis, what that is, what you mean by that, the kind of things we look at, and also a reasoning why social networks are so incredibly important in analytical sociology. Actually, if you ask me about what I'm doing all day long, if I'm not spending time on preparing some things for you guys or for other students, I study social networks. That's what I do. Yeah? So this is my research field. I think it's fascinating. It's incredibly cool, I think, and important, but also it does make sense from an epistemological point of view. And what I mean by that is in the way we know things, in the way we explain things, right? And when you remember all the things that we talked about so far, it was about, I'm trying to make this point about how phenomena in the social world come about through the actions and the interactions of individuals, then you see that actually the structure, how individuals interact with each other and what the broader pattern of that looks like, how that actually is incredibly important. How that is incredibly important to ultimately make sense of these interdependencies that lead to the outcomes that we observe, right? So what I want to do today, I want to talk more about, interdependencies and that, and how we actually formulate that within social network analysis, and then what social network analysis is, and then I will talk a little bit about two things that we do in network analysis. One is called, looking at distances between individuals through social networks, and the second one is centrality in networks. So lots of people look at that. But the reason why I'm looking at that is because it sets the scene for what I want to talk about on Thursday, which is this fascinating thing that your friends on average don't seem to be more important than you, but they're also better looking than you. So that's some studies that I've been doing. One paper published 2 years ago, and the other one I'm just writing up about these kind of things. And we need these kind of things to get to that. Okay, so let me get started and talk about interdependencies. So why social networks are important. There's a big community. I'm going to these conferences. There are thousands of people. It sort of it really got some momentum over the last few years. Lots of people really do it. Not just because there's fascinating data sets available, but also because people acknowledge. Even some of my colleagues now realize that in society, when we look at sociology, and when we look at social phenomena, it does make a lot of sense to think about individuals behaving in social contexts, right? Remember, that's sort of one of those big puzzles that I don't understand, how people can do sociology without thinking about the social context in which individuals act. And how people can do sociology without thinking about how individuals depend on others, which depend on others, which depend on others, and so on, right? So for me, this sort of really defeats the purpose of sociology when you take interdependencies out of the equation. Other than that, it's just pure, I don't know, simple description, not very intellectually pleasing in my view, and it's not really, I don't know, worth much in my opinion. So then you can actually just go and talk about stuff and talk about stuff in a pseudo fancy way, and there you are. A lot of people do that. To be honest, I hate it. I think that's not really what we are supposed to do. That's not really what good science is. That's not what good sociology is. So when you are in my class, you don't get very far with that. Okay, interdependencies. So why do we look at interdependencies? Remember, in analytical sociology, the idea is to get to, okay, what produces things, what are sort of called the cogs and wheels. That's sort of an expression that John Elster came up with. What are sort of the ingredients that kind of make and produce the social phenomena that we do observe? And we can think about it in this way. There are all these different wheels, sort of in all these different elements, whatever they are. It might be individuals, I don't know, it might be institutions, it might be, I don't know, culture, it might be all these kind of different things. They matter in here, and we want to understand why the world works the way it works. And in contrast to, let's say, a purely deductive nomological account, in analytical sociology, we want to understand the processes, how things come about. And the reason, hopefully I convinced you by now, the reason why this is important is because these dynamics, they can actually develop a life in there by themselves, right? Remember these threshold effects that we had, or segregation that we looked at last week, where nobody wants segregation, but we end up in a world where individuals are highly segregated, right? So that's sort of why we need to really look at how something comes about, how individuals behave and how this affects others and so on. And when we have these complexities, like in segregation, it doesn't mean that we cannot study them. I showed you how we can study these kind of things. Right? It requires maybe a different view on things. Sometimes then you need to, you can use computer simulations, or you can think through these dynamics, or you can look at the micro-level mechanisms and kind of then distinguish it from the phenomena that appear at the macro level at the end of the day, right? So we have segregation, that's one of the things that we had, segregation, and then we could think about, okay, common sense theory, what would drive, what could explain it, and we have said, okay, it could be that people are racist, maybe people don't like to be around dissimilar others, right? But then we kind of looked at two implications of that, what that would imply. For example, that there should be differences between the North and the South in the United States, or there should be differences in time as people became more tolerant, but there were no differences in segregation. So that's sort of a way how we kind of then refuted this idea of our common sense theory that it was all about discrimination. And that kind of probed us to look into more, okay, there apparently seems to be something else driving that. And then I showed you two models presented by Thomas Schelling that exactly focused on that. But how the actions and the interactions of individuals depend on each other and how that leads to an outcome. And coming back to this thing here, we not only just need to look at how things are related with each other to make sense out of why the wheels spin in a certain way in this case, but also because we might get it wrong if we don't get the relationships right. Because then we might think that kind of they are related in this way, and this is sort of what is driving the outcome that we observe, but in fact it works in another way. So that's sort of, an epistemological comprehension of network analysis. Most people they just do network analysis because it's cool, but I think there's a real reason why we should do it in analytical sociology. Okay, so we have these different elements, and now taking this idea further, now we can think of it as not just two things that are related with each other to understand, but there might be many different things how they are related with each other that lead to a certain outcome. And now here we are. Now these elements could be people, could be other institutions, it could be something else, could be organizations. And now we are already in network analysis, and now I showed you why networks matter, or why networks are important. in analytical sociology. Okay, so then there we are. That's sort of, I don't know, the point that I'm making, or that the point that I'm pushing with my whole research agenda, with all the things that I do, is that I think in order to get this boat here right, remember this is Coleman's boat. We talked about that at length. To get the association between macro phenomena right, we need to go through individuals. Individuals act. They're sort of the actors in the social world. Social phenomena don't just happen by themselves. Yeah? I don't believe in that. There are always individuals involved in that. Somebody has to do something. They might not always know what they are doing, or it might not always be intentional what they do, but somebody needs to do something. If there wouldn't be individuals doing something, things wouldn't happen, right? So I don't believe in this idea of higher beings, the society. There was this idea, the Leviathan, going back, and the philosophical thought, or I don't know, other people still believe in this idea that society sort of exists by itself and so on. I think that's bullshit. I think that's just an easy way out, because they don't understand how something at the macro level can be different from something at the micro level. Yeah. So they don't understand that. So in order to resolve that, people say, okay, well, the state exists as a whole, right? Or I don't know, there's something up there that exists as a whole at a higher level. They do that because they don't understand these kind of things we're talking about here, that macro level phenomena can be different from the individual's motivations that bring it about. Okay, so we are here, and now bringing these two things together, the macro level, the Coleman's boat, and then what I just talked about, these networks sort of linking the elements together. There we are, and I think that's a very convincing argument that in order for this Coleman's boat to sail, we need to have social networks at the very core of it. Okay, so that's the epistemological foundation of network analysis in analytical sociology, if you want to know about it. Okay, coming back to, remember I think it was our first lecture where we talked about what analytical sociology is, yeah? And we used sort of the quote from a friend of mine, from Gianluca Manzo, that he wrote in this book, in this introductory chapter. Let me quickly come back to it. He says, analytical sociology is the sociological perspective that seeks to systematically formulate and empirically test micro-founded mechanism-based explanations of complex macro-level patterns and dynamics. Okay, so he doesn't mention networks in there, although when you look at definitions of mechanisms, their networks are immediately in it. Right? There we talk about the actions and the interactions of individuals that bring about, I don't know, certain social phenomena. Yeah? So it's embedded, networks are embedded in this mechanism-based idea. But then on the top of that, in these dynamics as well. Why is that? Well, social life is inherently dynamic and interdependent. Yeah? So things depend on each other, things are related with each other, and I think they play a huge role, and I don't understand people who think otherwise. Okay, so analytical sociology, it emphasizes, it's nothing new, it emphasizes the importance of the processes, how something comes about, and it does so by looking at precise theories of individual action and interaction. Yeah. And then this is sort of now a more fancy network plot, something that you can look at and you can study, you can visualize it. Actually, some people, that's all they do, they visualize these kind of things. Yeah. And then you can actually analyze it, right? Which requires a different kind of thinking than what you might be used to. Okay, so dependencies are crucial. We know from many social settings, actually from most social settings that I can imagine, our observations are not independent from each other. What that means is that they are just depend on each other. Basically, what you do depends on what other people said, depends on what other people said, what other people did, and so on. I remember in the assignment I had asked you to give an example of social influence in your daily life. And when you start thinking about that, you start seeing social influence everywhere around you. And you start seeing how you are sitting, I don't know, right now next to your friends maybe, or how, I don't know, you started to sit next to each other at the beginning of the term, and then you got to know each other, and now you're friends, and that kind of changes the whole dynamic of the whole thing. Then you see how dependencies are incredibly crucial. Dependencies, we basically just mean that one thing depends on the other, here of our units, of our individuals in the social world. And when we look at here are some examples, and it's sort of some of the stuff that I study as well. You find dependencies for the adoption of innovation. It's a classic study. We had talked about that. Remember the medical innovation study, Menzel and others, that doctors start prescribing certain drugs when their golf buddies started to prescribe the same drug before. Right? So they build on the experiences, on the knowledge of others. We know smoking behavior is incredibly embedded in social context. Right? Actually, there we can even distinguish between two different ways how this happens. Well, first of all, we know that teenagers are incredibly susceptible to start smoking when their friends smoke. Well, they want to be cool. They haven't realized in life yet that I don't know, the coolest thing is actually to be your own person instead of trying to do what others do or trying to pretend to be cool. And so there's a lot of social influence when it comes to smoking. Yeah? At the same time, there's also selection effect, meaning that people smoke, they don't know each other, they hang out in the smoker's corner, and then they talk to each other. They can as well talk while they are there standing out there in the cold, doing something that they think is cool. And so new network ties or friendship relationships form because of that, which then have an impact on, I don't know, something else again, how opinions spread, or I don't know, or where you're sitting next to in a lecture theater. So smoking behavior, divorce is finally incredibly contagious as well. Right, so when you're married and people around you get divorced, your risk to get divorced, to have a divorce increases as well. Unfortunately, suicide is contagious as well. So when there people have suicide around them, their risk increases as well. Crime is contagious. That's actually something that I'm studying a lot these days. So I'm looking at the ways how crime is contagious. Deviant behavior is contagious, and what it actually means. What are the macro level implications of that? Remember, I had outlined this in one of those lectures that I'm looking at how this general pattern of the age crime curve. How there's a certain relationship between how old people are and how deviant they are. That actually can be explained through contagious crime. Thinking of crime as a disease and modeling it like that and studying it like that. Not to say that other things don't matter, there are surely lots of other things that matter as well that are just associated to individuals, but I think it would be wrong and foolish to ignore social networks, and nowadays when you talk with, intelligent people, they acknowledge that. Okay, so this was sort of the interdependencies, why these things matter and how they matter and so on. Now let's jump into social network analysis, what it actually is, how we do it, and I'm going to introduce a few concepts about this. So social networks, what are they not? Well, they are not these things. A lot of them, base on networks, or they have social graphs or whatnot, how you call it. But these are social media sites. That's a different thing. Facebook is not, there's a network embedded in there, but when we are talking about networks here, we're talking about these kind of things. It's about associations, it's about relational data. That's what it is at the end of the day. Well, obviously, you could Something like that underlies Facebook as well, right? You have your friends list and so on, but it doesn't have to be a website. It doesn't have to be something like that. Social networks are more general than that, and people studied these kind of things for a long, long time before already, right? Before the internet even existed. They looked at relationship between workers in companies. They look at friendship relationships in high schools. There's still a lot of work on being done on these kind of things, right? So we find it in many different aspects. It doesn't have to be just friendship. That's one of those things where people focused on, but actually it can be all sorts of relationships. Actually, I did some studies on denunciation networks. This is sort of a negative tie. People start to point finger at each other and say, this guy did something wrong, or this guy did something wrong, or this guy did something wrong. So in this case, the relationship is not a positive thing anymore. Right? It's not like a friendship tie, or people ask somebody for advice, or they like somebody, but it's actually a disliking relationship. So we can look at these kind of things as well, which makes this very interesting. I think even more when you combine these things, when you have positive and negative relationships, then we're talking about, then you can talk about social balance, which is a whole other thing to talk about. Fritz Heider, he's the kind of guy who wrote about social balance in the 1950s already. But let's leave it like that. So it can be social relationships, but they can be, governments can be or entire countries can be the units in here as well. Think about political alliances. Government agencies could be related with each other. Or some fascinating stuff. Think about the medieval times in Europe. There was a whole marriage policy about how different countries were related with each other through marriage links. The emperor sent their daughter to somewhere else, to Spain or to France to forge an alliance in that way. And even nowadays we have this kind of alliance. We have bilateral treatments. If you look at how the European Union works, it's actually through bilateral treatments. So, every country makes a treatment with every other country and so on. It can be, you find social networks when you look at markets, look at the flow of goods. These days look at the flow of migrants in Europe. That's definitely a network. Where do they come from? How do they go through? You see how now the actors are different units, how it can be countries or cities. It doesn't have to be just individuals. You can look at labor markets. You can also look at organizations and teams, interlocking directorates. It's one of those things where some people sit in the board of one company, and then some other people from that company sit in the board of another company, and so on. And that's sort of how boards are interlocked. That's what we call interlocking directorates. Or you can look at within team communications, email exchange, that sort of networks as well. Or I remember, I don't know if I showed you this example. I studied the networks of interaction in Premier League football teams. I studied who passes the ball to whom, and how does this sort of teach us something about how the team interacts, and how does this relate to the performance of the team at the end of the day. So once you kind of get into a relational view on the world, you see it in many different spheres, and it becomes hard to not see them anymore and to ignore them. But networks are even more universal from that. And now we're talking about social networks. Right? And actually there are a lot of folks that do network analysis outside of sociology. I'm teaching network analysis. Actually I write a book on how to do network analysis, and I get invited a lot to teach these kind of things. And there I have people from all disciplines. Now I have biologists, I have physicists, I have economists, I have some sociologists, all folks who study networks, right? Because the tools that we're using here, they are very universal. You can study at food webs. Food webs, that means which animal is eating which animal. And the internet, the internet is obviously a network. Power grids, airline networks. Now, some colleagues of mine, they looked at airline networks and they looked at how diseases spread. Their argument was that, diseases spread with people on planes. And actually, that's exactly what they found. You can look at metabolic networks, neural network, economic networks, all sorts of things that other disciplines get excited about. Okay, so here's one example. It's kind of, that was my research group back in the days, back in Oxford. The people I was working with, and actually I'm on this graph here as well, somewhere. You can look at different kinds of relationships. You can visualize things, although there's no computer program to do that. That's something you need to do by hand, or I had to do by hand. This is a study where I looked at the international art market. So now you see, when you look at these networks, you will always see sort of these dots, right? And then sort of some lines between these dots. You can add all sorts of other information into this. You can color your dots differently. You can color your lines differently. You can give them a different size and so on. Besides just making some cool plots that kind of can be very informative and can tell you things that you don't know otherwise. You can also then go in and study these kind of things in a statistical way. Or you can just describe it, which is what a lot of people do. So this is a network of the international art market, and now the dots, or we call them nodes or vertices, but I come back to that. But these dots, they represent art fairs. This is sort of how the art market works. They're sort of big exhibitions where galleries come together and they basically present their artists, right? And there are buyers coming in there. It's like a market. That's how it works. And then what we looked at which galleries go to which art fairs in the world. Some famous one. If you are in the art market, you recognize some. Art Basel, it's a very famous one, or Art Cologne, and or the Armory Show. It's a big one as well. And now we plotted a line between these two nodes when there was one art gallery that went to both of these art fairs. And by doing that repetitively, we have actually different width of these ties as well. Remember, some lines here are thicker than others. That means lots of galleries go to both of these art fairs, while when it's a thinner line, it means fewer galleries go to these art fairs. Then we color them differently. That basically means, was there this relationship there the year before? Right? And then there's a whole other thing, and that's a lot of the things that I do. I look at how networks change in time, how they evolve. And then we try to understand, why are there certain network relationships forming, why are others disappearing, and so on. What does it mean? You can read up on that. It's all published stuff. There's some other stuff that I did on co-offending. Again, you can read up on that if you want to. There we looked at, which I think was fascinating, a colleague of mine, he did his field work with a youth gang in London. Basically, he was hanging out with that gang for 2 years, was it even 3 years? And there was a lot of things happening. There was a lot of violence. There was one murder. He wasn't involved in it, luckily, but he was in touch with those gang members all the time. He wanted to understand how they work, how they recruit people into the gang, and when we started teaming up, and we looked at co-offending patterns within this youth gang. That means most often, or most of the crime is not committed by single individuals, but it's committed by at least pairs or groups of individuals. They hype each other up, and then they go and they break in somewhere, or I don't know, or do a robbery. Often it is co-offending that happens here, and then you can represent that as a network. So now what you see basically 54 dots. They represent the gang members in this youth gang in East London, and you see them with different colors, 4 different colors. That's basically the ethnic background of those kids. There was all one youth gang, and they were actually all black, and we called it, there's sort of more to this. There's sort of more than just the black youth gang or the Hispanic youth gang, but there's sort of ethnic diversity within the gang That was the whole point of this paper. And some of them are of Caribbean descent. They're from Jamaica. Others are from East Africa. Others from the UK. Others from West Africa. And then we looked at who is co-offending with whom. And the way we incorporated that data was basically through CCTV cameras, right? So we had access to that, or we had access from the police. They had observed this gang for a while. That's what the police does, and they kind of showed us the arrest records, who was arrested with whom, who was sort of spotted committing some crime with whom, and we used that information to essentially plot the co-offending network like that. But then we moved on. That was just the beginning. That's sort of the descriptive element, and then sort of all the fancy statistics came into play, which is the stuff that I do. And then we looked at is there a relationship between similarity in ethnicity and co-offending? Right? Basically, the question was very simple question: do individuals commit more crime with others who are similar to them? Right? Do they commit more crime with others who have the same ethnic background than they have? Yeah? So you see how now we look at ethnicity in a relational way. Actually, we compared it with the kind of activities that they do as well. That's what we did in the first paper. And there we found that ethnicity does not matter for the kind of crime that those kids commit. It doesn't matter whether they are in the drug business, in the weapon business, in the robberies or whatnot they do. It doesn't matter. There's no specialization here that you could say, I don't know, the Jamaicans, they run the drug business and so on, or something else. It's not like that. But ethnicity does matter with whom they do it. Right? Now you see, that's something that we would have overlooked very easily if we would not have thought about the relational aspects here. So ethnicity does not matter for what kind of crime they do, but it matters for with whom they do it, which gives us a revised understanding of ethnicity, the role of ethnicity in gangs, how gangs work. Actually, that's sort of the title of the book that my co-author and friend James wrote, How Gangs Work. Very interesting book if you're interested in these kind of things. So anyway, so that's sort of the stuff that we can study, but we'll come back to these kind of phenomena. Actually, we call that homophily. Homophily is a very general principle in network analysis. It means that ties are more likely to form between similar individuals. And when we start looking at that, you see it all over. You see it all over the place. You see it in high schools, starting with, I don't know, at an early stage, girls are more likely to befriend other girls, guys are more likely to befriend other guys. But then it goes on with education, it goes on with interests, with opinions. There's a lot of homophily in our social world. Meaning that the people, just think about the friends that you have, and think about how incredibly similar they are to you compared to the rest of the society. Okay, so that's one of very general principle, but we'll come back to that. Now here I have this stuff. That's a paper that I published, stuff that I did. Actually, that was my PhD thesis. How cool is that? As a PhD thesis, I looked at a hell of a lot of football matches. Actually, funny story, before my master's thesis was in Cambridge, I did look at food and eating and drinking behavior of individuals in the UK. I was interested in whether social class matters for kind of food and drinks that people order, what people eat and drink. So there was a time in my life, where these things were overlapping, where I could hang out in a pub and have some drinks, and watch some football matches and pretend to be working in two papers at the same time, at the eating and drinking stuff and at the football stuff. So what you see here, now you see, I don't know, some of you might have spotted it already, that's sort of Manchester United, some players. The dots now represent individuals, and the lines between them, actually now they have an arrowhead attached to it. They represent how many times this person passed the ball to somebody else. So when you look at this picture, there was still the time where Cristiano Ronaldo was playing in Manchester, God, this data is old by now. It's almost 10 years. But the interesting thing here is, he receives a lot of passes, but he doesn't make passes to somebody else. And there you can kind of then spot, okay, who are the critical players here? And you can see how we actually, nowadays, it's funny, I started this kind of stuff 10 years ago, but nowadays, big football teams have all picked up on these kind of things. This is, they all employ, this is sort of the money ball of football right now. But people kind of look at, okay, who are the crucial players? What do we need to do? How can we optimize our team play to be successful at the end of the day? So I was doing all these kind of things there 10 years ago. I was hoping for the Roman Abramovich Fellowship. Never happened, but nevertheless, this thing, as you can imagine, the media gets interested in this kind of stuff. So actually, I just had a recent paper that just got accepted, and I just did the finishing touches to this, where I moved this further, and I looked at what I call the relational value of experience in teams. So again, on the right-hand side, you see the passing network. It's sort of now a similar representation of the stuff that we had before. The dots, now we're talking about Arsenal, same year. You have the players, and they pass the ball between each other. There are different lines with different width. There's sort of lots of passes from Fabregas to Alexander Lepp at the time, while not that many passes between Eboye and Thierry Henry, right? So this is the passing network, and before I had actually established that this network really matters for the performance of teams, right? When you play in a decentralized way, you're more likely to win. So, I basically showed with lots of fancy statistics that tiki-taka style wins. But then the next question is, where do these networks come from, right? Why do some individuals pass the ball more between each other than others? So I looked actually at all the historical records, scraped this information from the web, and you can get that, about the career trajectories of those players. Where did they play in their career? Right? Where did they learn to play football? Which teams did they sign for? And then based on that, we can construct a second network, and that's sort of the one that you see on the left. You can construct a network where the strengths of these relationships indicate how long these two players know each other, how long they played in the same team. Right? And then the argument is, when you know somebody for longer, you get to know how those guys work, you get to know what they do, you get to know how they run, which means you should be better in passing the ball to them. Right? You are better to coordinate, and there's all sorts of ideas why that should be the case. Yeah? But that's a simple argument. And in a nutshell, that's exactly what I find. That's exactly what I find in this paper, The Relational Value of Experience in Teams, which is forthcoming in the American Behavioral Scientist. It's another paper. Actually, I talked about that just last week. Here, I'm going to talk about it again in the sociology seminar series. I might have mentioned it before. That's a network of denunciations. That's basically a huge corruption scandal that I studied, huge corruption scandal in Canada a few years back. And what happened is that then, in the aftermath of this corruption scandal, there was a big sort of public tribunal, which was funnily televised, where individuals had to testify, had to witness in front of a commission. And what happened is that they were called, went on for over half a year. They were called in front of that commission, and then they started to denounce others. They started to say, this other guy was involved in the corruption scandal, or this guy was involved in the corruption scandal. I didn't do it. This guy did it, and so on. Yeah? So that's exactly what you see. What you see here, you see sort of red individuals. They come in. These are actually the ones that kind of then testify, and then you see who they denounce. Yeah? Who they denounce. And the gist of this paper is, which we're currently revising for the American Journal of Sociology. So if that works out, that would be cool. The gist of this paper is that whatever people say, who they denounce, depends on all the denunciations that happened up to that point. Right? So basically, And we find evidence for that. If you denounce me, I'm more likely to denounce you as well, right? That makes a lot of sense. That's something we call reciprocity, right? If you pay effort into something, then I'm more likely to put effort into it as well, right? If you don't, I don't. That's sort of a relational aspect that we have here. And that if you name somebody as a friend, this person is more likely to name you as a friend as well. Here we find it in a negative sense. If you denounce me, I'm more likely to denounce you as well. On the top of that, we find evidence for scapegoating. So people jump on some individuals that are being identified as, they did it, although they might not have done it, but everybody says they did it. And then it's so much easier to point to that individual as well. Imagine you are a criminal. What are you going to do? You have to say something, right? So you can say something. You can point to somebody who had already been named by others. And by doing so, you say something without saying something new. Right? Which then could fire back on you. Because a lot of other people denounced this guy already before. So there are scapegoats being identified. On the top of that, we find evidence for collective punishment as well. But anyway, so this is sort of really just in a nutshell stuff. If you're more interested in these kind of things, there's a lot of research happening that I do with colleagues on this. The network paradigm essentially is that the unit of analysis are not individuals anymore, or single independent observations, but it's dyads. Yeah? And a dyad is basically a pair of two observations. That's the idea. That's sort of the smallest unit in networks. And you can see here how these things become very big, right? So even when I have just 10 individuals, there are 90 different combinations of those 10 individuals to put them together in pairs. I don't know, if I have 100 individuals, it becomes even more, right? It's quadratic to it. And then you can even go on and look at triadic configurations, you can look at quadratic configurations, and so on. Okay, so here I have now some definitions, so don't freak out about that. It's much simpler than it looks. In networks, a network is essentially defined as a set of two things. One is sort of our individuals, or we also call them nodes, or actors, or vertices. They're sort of the same names for basically the dots in these little graphs. Right? They can be big or small, can be individuals, can be art fairs, can be gang members, it can be football players, right? It can be guys in front of a commission. That's sort of the one thing that you need to have. You need to have individuals. And then on the top of that, you need to have the relations between them. And that's what we call edges or ties or arcs, or links. These are sort of the same names for these relationships. And you can represent these things in a very simple way. You have basically a set of, let's see it here. You can have a set of vertices. They have, I don't know, they have names or they have numbers, 1, 2, 3, something like that. And then you have a set of pairs of individuals. This basically now represents a relationship between individual number 1 and individual number 2. This represents a relationship between individual number 2 and individual number 5, and so on and so forth. Right? So that's basically how a network is defined. And then we can think of a network also as a matrix. Matrix is something like this. It's not just a number, but it's basically a table with lots of numbers in it. Right? And you can go into the first column and the first row, or you can go into the second row and the third column, and you'll find numbers in there. And that's how we can represent a network as well. But here you basically see it. How this works. This is now a representation of a network, and when you ask me about it, I'm thinking about this in matrices. This is sort of how I see a network. So you see sort of now a little plot here. There's sort of like some random network that I came up with. There are nodes. They have numbers attached to them, and there are little arrows between them, meaning that this guy sends a tie to this guy. Could mean now that this guy, I don't know, names this guy as a friend, but there's no tie the other way around. That means this guy is not naming this guy as a friend. So now that would be a non-reciprocal relationship. That would be a non-reciprocal relationship. And we can represent this whole network in this matrix here. That basically stands for the network. So we have our 7 individuals. We have 7 rows and 7 columns for each one of those individuals. And then we basically fill up this matrix with zeros and ones. 0 meaning there is no relationship. So now there would be no relationship from 1 to 3 because there is no tie. So when I look at the first row and the third column, there's a 0. First row, third column, there's a 0, meaning there is no relationship from this guy to this guy. While when I look at the third row and the first column, that means individual number 3, does he send a tie to individual number 1? Yes, here we are, there's a 1. Okay. So that's now, here you see, this is sort of how these things map onto each other. Now this 1 here in the matrix means there's a tie from individual number 3 to individual number 1. We can represent these things in different ways. And then network analysis is all about analyzing these networks, right? You can visualize them, you can plot them, you can make these fancy little movies. That's sort of in this book that I'm writing. But you can also do a whole bunch of other things. You can calculate node level characteristics, and that's kind of the stuff that I want to come back to next week. So I didn't get to the distances and to the centrality stuff, but I will talk about that on Thursday with you. And but before, because it is actually a very simple and yet fascinating piece, the paper by Scott Feld. It is part of the required reading list, so these things are all relevant for the exam. So I will ask you questions about these papers that are on the required reading list. And it's why your friends have more friends than you do. Okay, see you on Thursday.